I pushed open the heavy glass door of Vincenzo's, my 6-year-old son Matteo's small hand gripping mine with that particular combination of excitement and nervous energy that only a child on his birthday could possess, completely unaware that the man who destroyed me sat 20 feet away in the VIP section, surrounded by men in expensive suits, who moved with the particular stillness of predators pretending to be civilized. The same man whose child I'd hidden for half a decade, protecting our son from a world built on blood and power, and the kind of darkness that seeps into your bones until you forget what warmth feels like. The same man who'd chosen his empire over our unborn baby, who'd looked at me with those cold, beautiful eyes, and told me that children were liabilities in his world, weaknesses that enemies could exploit, and that if I truly loved him, I would understand that his business had to come first, always first, even before the tiny heartbeat growing inside me. The restaurant smelled like old money and fresh basil, that particular combination of luxury and tradition that made my stomach clench with memories I'd spent 6 years trying to bury in the darkest corners of my mind. And the hostess, a young woman with pin-straight black hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her calculating eyes, greeted us with the kind of warmth that was performative and professional rather than genuine. "Welcome to Vincenzo's. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her gaze flickering over my simple black dress and Matteo's carefully pressed button-down shirt that I'd bought specifically for this occasion, this one night where I wanted my son to feel special and celebrated and completely untouched by the complicated darkness of his origins. "Moretti, 7 o'clock, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt, even as my heart began that familiar painful rhythm that I associated with danger and loss, and the particular kind of heartbreak that never fully heals, just scabs over and waits for the slightest provocation to bleed fresh again. The hostess checked her leather-bound reservation book with manicured fingers, and I was about to relax into the false security of anonymity, about to believe that tonight would be exactly what I'd planned. A peaceful birthday dinner with my son in a beautiful restaurant, where we could pretend that our lives were normal and uncomplicated. When I felt it, that electric charge in the air that I'd learned to recognize 6 years ago, when I was stupid and young and convinced that dangerous men could be tamed by love. That presence that made every nerve ending in my body stand at attention. That particular quality of focused intensity that meant someone was watching me with the kind of attention that went beyond casual observation and ventured into the territory of possession and claim and all the things I'd run from when I finally found the strength to leave. I looked up, even though every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes down, to grab Matteo and run before recognition could fully form, before the fragile new life I'd built could come crashing down around me like shattered glass. And there he was, Dante Salvatore, sitting in the raised VIP section that overlooked the main dining room like a throne overlooking a kingdom. His dark eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat, and my knees threatened to buckle beneath me. He looked exactly the same, and completely different all at once, still devastatingly beautiful in that sharp, dangerous way that had first drawn me to him when I was 22, and working as a paralegal at a firm that occasionally did legitimate business for his less legitimate empire, still possessed of those striking features that seemed carved from marble by some Renaissance sculptor who understood that beauty and cruelty could coexist in the same face. His dark hair was perhaps slightly shorter than I remembered, touched with just a hint of silver at the temples that only made him more distinguished, more powerful, more everything that had terrified and attracted me in equal measure. And he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my current rent, custom-tailored to his broad shoulders and lean frame in a way that made it clear he was a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But it was his eyes that held me captive, those impossibly dark eyes that I'd once thought I could read like my favorite book, eyes that had looked at me with passion and possession and occasionally something that might have been love, if men like Dante Salvatore were capable of that particular emotion in any form that didn't involve ownership and control. Right now, those eyes were moving from my face downward, tracking the trajectory of my gaze until they landed on Matteo, on my beautiful boy, with his dark curls and olive skin, and the exact same sharp cheekbones that marked him as unmistakably Dante's son, marked him as belonging to a legacy of violence and power that I'd tried so desperately to keep him from. I watched Dante's entire body go rigid, watched his jaw clench with that particular tension that I remembered from our marriage, from the moments when he was processing information that changed everything he thought he knew. And I saw the exact moment when recognition clicked into place, when he registered not just my presence but the implications of the child standing beside me, the child who was clearly, undeniably, impossibly his. His hand, which had been resting casually on the table beside a glass of what I knew would be top-shelf scotch, slowly curled into a fist, knuckles going white with the force of whatever emotions he was restraining behind that carefully controlled expression that he wore like armor against a world that would exploit any weakness. "Mama, why are we just standing here?" Matteo tugged on my hand with the impatience of a 6-year-old who'd been promised birthday pasta and couldn't understand why we weren't already seated. And his voice, sweet and innocent and completely oblivious to the danger that stalked toward us in Italian leather shoes, snapped me out of my frozen paralysis. "Sorry, baby. We're going to our table right now," I said, forcing brightness into my tone even as I felt Dante's gaze burning into me like a brand, even as I saw him stand from his seat with that fluid, predatory grace that had once made my pulse race with desire rather than fear, even as I realized with growing horror that the hostess was leading us not to some quiet corner table where we could disappear into anonymity, but toward the main dining room that sat directly in Dante's line of sight, as if the universe itself had conspired to ensure that there would be no escape from this confrontation that I'd spent 6 years dreading and preparing for, in equal measure. The memory hit me suddenly, violently, the way trauma always does when you least expect it, dragging me back 6 years to the night everything shattered beyond repair, to the hospital room where I'd lost our daughter at 20 weeks, where I'd hemorrhaged and nearly died while Dante was in Sicily, closing some deal that he'd insisted couldn't wait. That was more important than being by my wife's side during the worst moment of her life. I remembered waking up alone in that sterile white room, remembered the doctor's gentle voice explaining that I'd lost the baby, a girl, perfect and beautiful and gone before she ever had a chance to breathe. And I remembered the hollow devastation that had settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and permanent. I remembered calling Dante 17 times before he finally answered, his voice clipped and irritated at the interruption. And I remembered the way my voice had broken as I told him, "She's gone. Our baby is gone." And I remembered the pause, the terrible pause that stretched for 3 seconds too long before he said, "I'm sorry, Sienna, but I can't leave right now. This deal is worth 40 million, and these men don't wait for personal emergencies. I'll be home in 3 days." I remembered hanging up the phone and staring at the ceiling and feeling something fundamental break inside me, some essential piece of my soul that had still believed that I mattered to him, that our family mattered to him, that anything mattered to him beyond his empire and his power, and his relentless climb to the top of a hierarchy built on violence and fear. What he didn't know, what I'd never told him, was that the ultrasound had shown twins, 2 heartbeats instead of 1, and when I'd lost our daughter, our son had somehow survived, clinging to life with the same stubborn determination that I saw in him every day now. The doctors had called it a miracle, had said that it was extraordinarily rare for one twin to survive when the other didn't. But I'd known even then, still bleeding and broken in that hospital bed, that I would never tell Dante about the surviving child, that I would disappear and raise our son far away from the darkness that Dante called his legacy. I'd left the hospital 3 days later, while Dante was still in Sicily, and I'd withdrawn the emergency cash I'd been secretly saving for years. The money I'd hidden because some part of me had always known that one day I might need to run, and I'd disappeared into a network of women's shelters and assumed names, and eventually a new city where no one knew Sienna Salvatore, where I could become just Sienna Moretti again, where I could raise my son in peace and safety and love instead of fear. "This is lovely," I heard myself say to the hostess as she gestured to our table, a small two-top with a perfect view of the VIP section, with a perfect view of Dante, who was now standing, his massive frame radiating barely contained fury, and something else. Something that looked almost like pain if I didn't know better. If I hadn't learned the hard way that men like Dante Salvatore didn't feel pain the way normal people did. They felt rage and possession and the burning need for control, but never the kind of vulnerability that pain required. I helped Matteo into his chair, smoothing his hair with trembling fingers, trying to memorize every detail of his face because some instinct told me that everything was about to change, that the careful life I'd built was about to come crashing down. And I wanted to remember this moment, this last moment of the before, when he was still just mine, still untouched by the legacy of violence and power that flowed through his veins whether I wanted it to or not. "Can I get the spaghetti carbonara?" Matteo asked, bouncing in his seat with excitement. His dark eyes, Dante's eyes, God. How had I never fully registered how much those eyes were Dante's eyes, sparkling with the simple joy of a child who believed the world was good and safe, and that birthday dinners in fancy restaurants were pure magic. "You can get anything you want, sweet boy," I whispered, my throat tight with unshed tears and fear, and the desperate desire to protect him from everything that was coming. Everything that I could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable and destructive. I felt Dante's presence before I saw him, felt the way the air seemed to shift and charge with electricity, felt the way conversations at nearby tables died down as people recognized the predator moving through their space. And when I finally looked up, he was standing beside our table, towering over us with his hands in his pockets, in a pose that might have looked casual on anyone else, but on Dante looked like a cobra preparing to strike, coiled and dangerous, and absolutely in control. "Sienna," he said, and my name on his lips after 6 years of silence was like a gunshot in the quiet restaurant, sharp and violent and impossible to ignore. "It's been a long time, hasn't it, cara mia?" Matteo looked up at the strange man with curious, fearless eyes, and I watched my son, our son, smile at his father for the first time, completely unaware that the man standing before us had the power to destroy everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd become in the years since I'd walked away from Dante Salvatore and his empire of blood and darkness. I opened my mouth to speak, to lie, to protect my child with whatever words I could find, but before I could form a single syllable, Dante's eyes moved from me to Matteo, and I saw his jaw clench with recognition, saw understanding dawn across his features like a sunrise that promised not warmth, but devastation, and I knew with terrible certainty that my time was up, that the reckoning I'd been running from had finally, inevitably, caught up with me. My first instinct was to run, to grab Matteo and bolt for the door like a frightened animal fleeing from a predator that had finally cornered its prey, after a long and patient hunt. But my son was already chattering about the enormous crystal chandelier that hung above us like a cascade of frozen diamonds, completely oblivious to the fact that the predator stalking toward us in a $3,000 suit was his father, the man whose DNA he carried in every cell of his body, the man whose dangerous legacy I'd spent 6 years trying to outrun. "That's so cool, Mama. It looks like something from a castle," Matteo said with the breathless wonder that 6-year-olds possessed in abundance. And I wanted to freeze this moment, to preserve his innocence in amber before Dante's presence shattered the carefully constructed reality I'd built for us, before my son learned that his father was a king of a very different kind of kingdom, one built on violence and fear and the kind of power that corrupted everything it touched. Dante reached our table before I could formulate any kind of coherent plan, before I could manufacture a lie convincing enough to explain away the child who sat beside me with his father's eyes, and his father's bone structure, and his father's presence, even at 6 years old, that commanded attention in a way that normal children simply didn't. He stood there, this man who had once been my husband, my lover, my tormentor, and my greatest mistake. And the air between us crackled with 6 years of unspoken words and unresolved trauma and the kind of fury that burned cold rather than hot. The dangerous kind that led to calculated revenge rather than explosive confrontation. "Sienna," he said again, and his voice was deadly calm. That particular tone I remembered from our marriage. The one he used when he was moments away from doing something violent but wanted to maintain the veneer of civilization. The tone that made every muscle in my body tense with the anticipation of danger. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? 6 years, 2 months, and 14 days, to be precise. Not that I've been counting the days since my wife disappeared, without a trace, without a word, without even the courtesy of a goodbye or an explanation." The bitter emphasis on wife made me flinch, because technically he was right. I had never filed for divorce, had simply vanished into the kind of anonymity that required forged documents and cash transactions and a complete severing of every tie to my former life. And in the eyes of the law and the church and whatever twisted bond still existed between us, I was still Sienna Salvatore, still bound to this man who looked at me now with eyes that promised retribution and demanded answers in equal measure. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, knowing even as the words left my mouth that lying to Dante Salvatore was an exercise in futility, that he could read deception in the set of my shoulders and the flutter of my pulse at my throat, and the way my fingers tightened protectively on Matteo's shoulder. "I think you have me confused with someone else. We were just trying to have a nice dinner, and I would appreciate it if you would leave us alone." Dante's laugh was low and dark, and completely devoid of humor. The kind of sound that made something primal in my hindbrain scream warnings about apex predators and the futility of escape. And he pulled out the chair across from me without asking permission, settling into it with the casual authority of a man who owned not just this restaurant, but probably half the city. A man who had never in his life been told no, and actually accepted that answer. "Don't insult my intelligence, Kara. It's beneath you and frankly insulting to both of us after everything we've been through together," he said. And then his eyes, those impossibly dark eyes that had haunted my dreams and nightmares for 6 years, moved deliberately to Matteo, studying my son with an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. I watched with growing horror as Dante raised his hand, snapping his fingers once in a gesture that was subtle but unmistakable. And within seconds, men began materializing from various corners of the restaurant, positioned at every exit with the kind of casual menace that made it clear we were trapped, that he had orchestrated this entire encounter with the precision of a military operation, that nothing about this chance meeting was actually chance at all. The other diners seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, or perhaps they were simply too wise to acknowledge what was happening, too aware of who Dante Salvatore was and what crossing him might mean for their continued health and well-being. "I'm hungry, Mama," Matteo said, tugging on my sleeve with the persistence of a child who had been promised birthday pasta and couldn't understand why we weren't ordering yet, and the normalcy of his complaint against the absolute abnormality of our situation made my chest tighten with fear and love, and the desperate need to protect him from everything that was about to unfold. Dante's expression softened imperceptibly as he looked at Matteo, something flickering across his features that might have been wonder or pain or some complicated combination of emotions that I couldn't fully decipher. And then he was gesturing to a waiter who appeared instantly as if summoned by invisible strings, his deference to Dante making it clear who actually controlled this establishment and everyone in it. "Bring your finest children's menu immediately," Dante ordered, his voice still carrying that edge of barely restrained fury, even as he attempted something approximating gentleness. "And make sure the kitchen prepares something special? It appears we're celebrating a birthday, aren't we?" The way he said it, with that particular emphasis on birthday, made it clear that he'd already done the math, had already calculated the timing, and realized that Matteo's age corresponded almost exactly to when I'd left him, when I'd supposedly lost our baby, and disappeared from his life. And I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. The terrible understanding that was beginning to crystallize into certainty. "How did you know it was his birthday?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, panic making me reckless even though I knew that showing fear to a man like Dante was like bleeding in shark-infested waters, an invitation for him to strike harder and deeper until he got what he wanted. "I make it my business to know everything about everyone who matters to me," Dante replied, and the possessive undertone in his words made my skin prickle with awareness and old memories of how suffocating his brand of love could be, how it felt less like devotion and more like ownership. "Did you really think you could live in my city, in my territory, without me eventually finding out? I've known you were here for 3 months, Sienna. I've been watching you take our son to school every morning, watching you work at that little law firm on 5th Street, watching you build a life that should have included me. And I've been waiting for the right moment to remind you that you can't just walk away from me, from us, from the vows we took before God and family." The revelation that he'd been watching us, that he'd known where we were and what we were doing, and had simply been biding his time like a spider waiting for the perfect moment to spring its trap, made bile rise in my throat, and my hands shake with a combination of fury and terror that I struggled to contain. "You had me followed?" I hissed, leaning forward so that Matteo wouldn't hear the venom in my voice, wouldn't understand that the handsome stranger at our table was actually a threat, rather than just an oddly persistent man. "You've been stalking us for 3 months, and you're acting like I'm the one who did something wrong. You have no right to spy on my son. No right to insert yourself into our lives after everything you did. After the way you treated me. After you proved that nothing mattered to you except your empire and your power and your endless fucking need to control everything around you." "My son," Dante corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that sent chills racing down my spine, and he leaned forward too, bringing us close enough that I could smell his cologne, that familiar scent of sandalwood and danger that used to make me feel safe and desired, but now just made me feel trapped. "You mean my son, don't you, Sienna? Because unless the laws of biology have changed dramatically in the past 6 years, that beautiful boy sitting beside you with my eyes and my mother's nose and my family's bone structure is very much mine, isn't he? So why don't you drop the pretense and tell me why you lied about losing our baby? Why you let me believe for 6 years that I'd lost my only child? Why you robbed me of watching him grow and learn and become whoever he's becoming without me?" I tried to maintain my composure, tried to formulate a response that would protect Matteo from the truth of his origins. But before I could speak, my son decided to interject himself into the conversation with the fearless curiosity that children possessed before the world taught them caution. "Are you a friend of Mama's?" Matteo asked, looking up at Dante with those dark eyes that were mirror images of the man across from us. And I watched my ex-husband's face transform, softening in a way I'd never seen during our entire marriage, revealing a vulnerability that I hadn't known he was capable of displaying. "I'm an old friend, yes," Dante said, and his voice when he spoke to Matteo was gentle in a way it had never been with me, careful and measured as if he were handling something infinitely precious and breakable. "My name is Dante, and I'm very happy to meet you. What's your name?" "I'm Matteo," my son announced proudly, "and today is my birthday. I'm 6 years old now, which means I'm basically a grown-up. That's what Mama says anyway. And we're having a special dinner because Mama promised I could get anything I want since it's my special day." I watched the color drain from Dante's face as our son confirmed what he'd already suspected. Watched him do the mental calculation of Matteo's age against the timeline of my departure. Watched understanding and fury, and something that looked almost like grief war across his features, before he locked them down behind that impenetrable mask he wore so well. 6 years old, Dante repeated slowly, and when his eyes met mine again, they were filled with such cold rage that I actually recoiled in my chair, pressing back against the cushion as if I could disappear into it. 6 years old, which means you were pregnant when you left, which means you lied about the miscarriage, which means you've been raising my son, my heir, my blood without me for his entire life, while I mourned a child who was never actually dead. You don't understand, I started to say, but Dante cut me off with a sharp gesture that made me fall silent immediately. Old instincts from our marriage kicking in, despite my 6 years of independence, despite everything I'd done to become stronger and braver, and less susceptible to his particular brand of intimidation. You're absolutely right. I don't understand, Dante said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that promised retribution. Which is why we're going to have a very long conversation about this, but not here, not in front of him, not in a public place where you might be tempted to make a scene or try to run again. Because I promise you, Sienna, if you try to disappear with my son one more time, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and I will take him from you permanently. Do you understand me? The threat hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. And I knew he meant every word because Dante Salvatore was many things. Cruel, controlling, possessive to the point of obsession. But he was never a liar. He believed that lies were for weaker men who didn't have the power to simply take what they wanted by force if necessary. The waiter arrived with menus and a children's coloring page featuring various Italian foods, and Matteo immediately became absorbed in choosing which crayons to use, giving us a moment of privacy in the midst of our very public confrontation. I did what I had to do to protect him from your world, I whispered fiercely, leaning across the table so our conversation wouldn't reach Matteo's ears. From the violence and the crime and the constant danger, from growing up knowing that his father was a man who chose power over family, who couldn't even be bothered to come to the hospital when I was losing our baby, who made it crystal clear that children were liabilities rather than blessings. So don't you dare act like I'm the villain here when you drove me away with your coldness and your cruelty and your complete inability to prioritize anything except your empire. Dante's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, and for a moment I thought he might actually lose control, might reach across the table and do something violent that would finally reveal to Matteo the kind of man his father truly was. But instead he took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders and fixed me with a look that promised this conversation was far from over. You have 2 choices, cara mia, and I suggest you choose wisely because I'm only going to offer this option once before I let my lawyers and my considerable resources do the talking for me, he said, pulling out his phone and sliding it across the table to show me a screen displaying legal documents that made my blood run cold. You can come to my estate tonight after you put our son to bed, and we can have a civilized conversation about how we're going to handle this situation going forward, about how we're going to tell him who I am, and what role I'm going to play in his life. Or I can have my lawyers file for full custody by morning, and I promise you, Sienna, I have judges in my pocket. I have politicians who owe me favors. I have enough power and influence to make sure that you never see our son again except for supervised visitations if I'm feeling particularly generous. The documents on his phone were real. I could see that immediately, drafted by one of the most prestigious family law firms in the city, and they outlined a custody case that would paint me as an unstable woman who'd stolen a child and hidden him from his father, who'd lied about a miscarriage and disappeared with no regard for paternal rights or the child's best interests. And I knew that with Dante's money and connections, he could absolutely make those lies sound like truth, could absolutely destroy me in court and take Matteo away. And the thought of losing my son, my beautiful boy, who was my entire world, made panic claw at my throat like a living thing. That's not a choice, that's a threat, I managed to say, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound strong and unaffected, because even after 6 years of building a new life, of becoming a different person, Dante still had the power to reduce me to that frightened girl who'd loved him too much and paid too high a price for that devotion. Call it what you want, Dante replied, pocketing his phone and standing from the table with that fluid grace that made him seem more dangerous somehow, more predatory. But be at the estate by 9 o'clock tonight. You remember the address, I know you do, and come alone because if you bring anyone with you, or try to involve the police or do anything except show up and have an honest conversation with me, I will assume you're not interested in cooperating, and I will proceed accordingly with legal action that will make your life infinitely more complicated than it needs to be." He turned to leave but paused, looking down at Matteo, who was now deeply focused on coloring a cartoon pizza, and I saw his hand twitch as if he wanted to reach out and touch our son's hair to make some physical connection with this child he'd just discovered. But he restrained himself, maintaining the fiction that he was just a random acquaintance rather than the biological father who'd just had his entire world tilted on its axis. "Happy birthday, Matteo," Dante said softly, and there was something raw in his voice that I'd never heard before, something almost vulnerable that made my chest ache despite everything. "I hope you enjoy your dinner, and I hope that you have many, many more birthdays ahead of you, birthdays that I fully intend to be present for from now on." He walked away then, his men melting back into the shadows from which they'd emerged, and I was left sitting at our table with our son, who continued coloring happily, completely unaware that his world had just been irrevocably changed, that the father he'd never known had found us, and was demanding his place in our lives with the same ruthless determination that he applied to everything else he wanted. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to clasp them together under the table, and I felt tears threatening to spill over, even though I refused to cry, refused to let Dante see that he still had this effect on me, that after 6 years of distance and healing, he could still shatter my carefully constructed composure with nothing more than his presence and his threats and his undeniable claim on the child I'd been raising alone. "Mama, who was that man?" Matteo asked suddenly, looking up from his coloring with those two perceptive eyes that missed nothing, and I realized with dawning horror that I was going to have to figure out how to explain Dante Salvatore to our son eventually, how to tell him that his father was a dangerous man who lived in a dangerous world, but who apparently wanted to be part of his life despite everything, and I had absolutely no idea how to do that without destroying the innocence and security I'd worked so hard to give him. "Just an old friend, baby," I lied, smoothing his hair and forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face in half. "Nobody important. Now let's look at these menus and figure out what you want to order, okay? This is your special night, and I want it to be perfect." But even as I said the words, even as Matteo launched into an excited description of all the different pasta dishes he wanted to try, I knew that nothing would ever be perfect again, that Dante Salvatore had walked back into my life with all the subtlety of an earthquake, and I had exactly 4 hours to figure out how I was going to face him tonight at the estate where our marriage had died, where I'd learned that love wasn't enough to change a man who was fundamentally committed to darkness, and where I would now have to negotiate the terms of our son's future with the only man who had ever truly terrified me. I hadn't stepped foot in the Salvatore compound in 6 years, but it looked exactly the same as I drove through the massive iron gates that swung open automatically, as if the security system still recognized my car, still recognized me as someone who belonged here despite the fact that I'd fled this beautiful prison in the dead of night, with nothing but a suitcase and a secret growing in my belly. A beautiful prison wrapped in marble and blood money, and the kind of old-world luxury that was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The long driveway curved through meticulously landscaped gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's yearly salaries, past fountains that cascaded with water, even at this late hour, their lights casting dancing shadows across perfectly manicured hedges that had been shaped into elaborate designs that spoke of wealth so excessive it bordered on obscene. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that was part fear and part something else. Something I didn't want to examine too closely because it felt dangerously close to anticipation, to the old pull that Dante had always exerted on me like a moon controlling the tides, dragging me toward him even when every rational part of my brain screamed that he was dangerous and toxic and completely wrong for me in every possible way. I'd left Matteo with my best friend Elena, the only person in my new life who knew the truth about my past, who'd promised to keep my son safe and entertained with movies and popcorn while I went to confront the father he didn't know he had. And the guilt of lying to my child about where I was going tonight sat heavy in my stomach like a stone. The main house loomed ahead of me, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that had been in the Salvatore family for 3 generations. Built by Dante's grandfather with money earned through bootlegging during Prohibition and expanded by his father through various enterprises, both legitimate and otherwise. And looking at it now, I was transported back to the first time Dante had brought me here, when I'd been young and naive and so desperately in love that I'd convinced myself that the darkness surrounding his family was just background noise, something that didn't really touch us, something that wouldn't matter as long as we had each other. How spectacularly wrong I'd been about that. How thoroughly I'd underestimated the way that darkness would seep into every corner of our lives, poisoning everything it touched until there was nothing left of the girl I'd been, the girl who'd believed in happy endings and the redemptive power of love. I parked in the circular drive in front of the main entrance, next to a sleek black Mercedes that I didn't recognize, and 2 SUVs that I knew belonged to Dante's security detail. And for a moment, I just sat there in my modest Honda, staring up at the house and trying to gather the courage to walk back into the place where so many of my worst memories had been created, where I'd learned what it meant to love someone who was fundamentally incapable of putting anything before his empire, his legacy, his obsessive need for control and power. The front door opened before I could make myself move, and one of Dante's men, Marco, I remembered his name was Marco. He'd been one of the kinder ones during my time here, gestured for me to come inside, his expression carefully neutral in that way that all of Dante's employees had mastered, revealing nothing of what they might think about the reappearance of the boss's missing wife. "Mrs. Salvatore, Mr. Salvatore is waiting for you in his study," Marco said as I climbed out of my car on legs that felt unsteady, and the use of my married name, a name I hadn't heard in 6 years, made something twist painfully in my chest because it was a reminder that legally, officially, I was still bound to Dante despite the years and distance and the new life I'd built for myself and our son. I followed Marco through the familiar halls, past artwork that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime, past furniture that had been imported from Italy and France and God knows where else, past all the trappings of wealth that had once seemed glamorous and exciting, but now just felt oppressive, like the physical manifestation of everything that was wrong with Dante's world, everything that valued things over people, and power over love. We passed the formal dining room, where we'd hosted dinners for Dante's business associates, men whose smiles never quite reached their eyes, and whose conversations were filled with coded references to things I'd learned not to ask about. And we passed the library where I'd spent so many lonely evenings waiting for Dante to come home from whatever business had taken him away, reading book after book to fill the emptiness that seemed to expand every day of our marriage. But it was when we passed the East Wing bathroom that I had to stop, had to press my hand against the wall to steady myself as the memory crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. The memory of lying on the cold tile floor at 20 weeks pregnant, bleeding and cramping and sobbing while I called for help that seemed to take forever to arrive, while I felt one of my babies slip away and prayed desperately that the other would survive, while I waited for my husband who was in another country and couldn't be bothered to cut short his business trip even for this, even for the loss of our child and the possibility that I might not survive the hemorrhaging that the doctors would later tell me was a miracle I'd lived through at all. "Mrs. Salvatore, are you all right?" Marco asked, and I realized I'd been standing there frozen for long enough that he'd noticed, long enough that concern had broken through his carefully maintained professional demeanor. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing myself to move forward, to put one foot in front of the other, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, to get back in my car and drive away and never look back. Consequences be damned. "Just remembering things I'd rather forget, that's all. Please lead the way." Marco brought me to the heavy wooden door of Dante's private study, the inner sanctum where he conducted his most sensitive business, and where I'd only been invited a handful of times during our entire marriage, and he knocked twice before opening it and gesturing for me to enter, then retreating and closing the door behind me with a soft click that sounded absurdly final, like the closing of a coffin lid or a prison cell door. The study looked exactly as I remembered it. All dark wood and leather and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions and rare volumes that Dante collected obsessively. And behind the massive desk that dominated the room sat the man himself, my husband, my ex-lover, my greatest mistake, the father of my child, looking every bit the powerful crime lord that he was in his shirt sleeves with his tie loosened and a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. "You came," Dante said, and there was something in his voice that might have been surprise or relief or satisfaction. I couldn't quite tell which. And he stood from his chair with that fluid grace that still made my pulse quicken despite everything, despite my best efforts to remain unmoved by his physical presence. "Did I have a choice?" I shot back, staying near the door because moving deeper into the room felt like walking into a trap, felt like giving ground that I might never be able to reclaim. "You threatened to take my son away from me if I didn't show up, so here I am. Let's get this conversation over with so I can go home to Matteo and try to figure out how I'm going to explain to him that the man from the restaurant is actually his father, the father I've been lying about his entire life." Dante's expression hardened at my words, and he set down his glass with enough force that the crystal rang against the wood of his desk, a sharp sound that made me flinch despite myself. "Don't you dare try to play the victim here, Sienna, not when you're the one who lied, who stole 6 years of my son's life from me, who let me believe that I'd lost my only child when all along you were raising him somewhere, teaching him to walk and talk and be a person without me, without giving me any say in the matter or any chance to be part of his life," he said, his voice rising with each word until he seemed to catch himself, taking a deep breath and visibly fighting for control in a way that reminded me of the old Dante, the one who'd been so determined never to show weakness or lose his composure even when he was furious. "You told me children were liabilities," I said, my own voice shaking with the force of emotions I'd kept locked away for 6 years, emotions that were now pouring out of me like blood from a wound that had never properly healed. "You told me that bringing a baby into your world would make them a target? That you didn't want the responsibility or the weakness that came with having someone you couldn't protect completely? And then when I lost our daughter, when I was bleeding out in that bathroom while you were in Sicily closing some deal that was more important than your wife's life, you proved every single one of my worst fears about what kind of father you would be, about what kind of man you really were beneath all the charm and the passion and the pretty words about forever." I watched as the color drained from Dante's face, watched as something that looked almost like pain flickered across his features before he locked it down behind that impenetrable mask he wore so well, and he moved around the desk toward me with slow, deliberate steps that reminded me of a predator stalking prey. "You think I don't regret that?" he asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and there was something raw in it that I'd never heard before, something vulnerable that didn't match the Dante I remembered from our marriage. "You think I don't hate myself every single day for not being there when you needed me, for prioritizing business over my wife, for being so goddamn determined to prove myself to men who didn't matter that I failed the one person who did? I got the call about the miscarriage while I was sitting across from Roberto Castellano, negotiating a deal that I thought would solidify our family's position for the next decade, and I made a choice. The worst choice of my entire life. To stay and finish what I'd started instead of getting on a plane immediately and coming home to you." He was close enough now that I could see the fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago, could see the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, could smell that familiar scent of sandalwood and expensive cologne, and something underneath that was just uniquely Dante. And I hated that my body still responded to his presence, that some traitorous part of me still remembered what it felt like to be held by him, to be wanted by him, to believe that his particular brand of obsessive intensity meant love rather than possession. "Your regret doesn't change anything," I said, but my voice came out softer than I'd intended, less confrontational and more weary, because I was so tired of carrying all this pain and anger and resentment, so tired of being the guardian of secrets that were poisoning me from the inside out. "Your regret doesn't erase the fact that I nearly died alone. that I lost our daughter alone, that I made the decision to leave you alone because you'd made it abundantly clear through your actions that I would always be second to your empire, that any children we had would grow up watching their father choose power over family again and again until they learned that love was conditional and protection was an illusion. I know, Dante said, and his hand came up as if to touch my face. But he stopped himself, letting it fall back to his side in a gesture of restraint that seemed to cost him something. I know I failed you. I know I was a terrible husband. I know that my coldness and my obsession with building an empire that couldn't be touched drove you away. But Sienna, you have to understand something. My coldness wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I cared too much. Because I watched my own father get gunned down in front of me when I was 6 years old, and I learned that love makes you vulnerable, that the people you care about can be used against you, that showing emotion is the same as handing your enemies a weapon to destroy you with. The revelation that his father had died when Dante was the same age as Matteo was, now hit me like a physical blow. Because in all our time together, in all the late-night conversations and early morning confessions, he'd never told me the details of his father's death, had only ever said that it happened when he was young, and that it had taught him to be strong, to never show weakness, to build walls so high that nothing could touch him. I didn't know, I whispered, because what else could I say to something like that? To the understanding that Dante's emotional unavailability hadn't been just cruelty or indifference, but a learned survival mechanism, a way of protecting himself from the kind of devastating loss that had shaped his entire childhood. There's a lot you didn't know, Dante continued, and now he did touch me, his hand coming up to cup my cheek with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything I knew about him, everything I'd experienced during our marriage. There's a lot I didn't tell you because I thought keeping you separate from the worst parts of my world would keep you safe, would keep you from becoming a target. But all it did was push you away and make you feel alone and unloved, and I am sorrier for that than you will ever know. Sorrier than I have words to express. I should have stepped back, should have put distance between us before his touch could undermine my resolve. But instead I found myself leaning into his palm, like a flower turning toward the sun. Found myself closing my eyes against the tears that threatened to spill over. Found myself remembering why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Back when I'd thought that beneath all his darkness there was a man capable of real tenderness, real vulnerability, real love. Being sorry doesn't change the past, I said. But my voice broke on the words, betraying the fact that despite everything, despite 6 years of distance and healing and building a new life, I wasn't as immune to Dante Salvatore as I'd convinced myself I was. No, it doesn't, Dante agreed, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone in a caress that felt almost reverent. But it can change the future. It can change what happens next with Matteo, with us, with the family we could still be if you'd give me a chance to prove that I've changed, that I've spent the last 6 years becoming a man worthy of you both. A man who understands that some things are more important than power and territory and the respect of men who would sell their own mothers for the right price. How can I trust that? I asked, opening my eyes to look directly into his, to search for some sign of deception or manipulation, but finding only what appeared to be genuine sincerity, genuine pain, genuine hope that terrified me because hoping meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant risking the kind of destruction that I'd barely survived the first time. How can I believe that you've actually changed when change is so fundamentally against your nature? When you've built your entire life on being unmovable and uncompromising, and absolutely in control of everything around you? Dante's other hand came up to frame my face, holding me gently, but firmly, making it impossible to look away from the intensity in his dark eyes. And I could feel my heart racing, could feel my carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble under the weight of his presence and his words, and the undeniable pull that still existed between us, like a physical force. Because I've been quietly exiting the most violent aspects of the business, he said, his voice urgent now, desperate to make me understand, to make me believe. Because I've spent the last 3 years transitioning our operations toward legitimate enterprises, real estate development, construction, investments in tech startups. Because I knew that even if I never found you, even if I spent the rest of my life alone, I needed to become the kind of man who could sleep at night without seeing the faces of everyone I'd hurt, everyone I'd destroyed in my climb to the top of a hierarchy built on blood and fear. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that people could fundamentally change, that the man who'd broken my heart and driven me away could somehow transform into the father that Matteo deserved, the partner that I'd once dreamed he could be. But 6 years of single parenthood had taught me to be cautious, had taught me that pretty words were easy and actions were what mattered, and I needed more than promises and declarations before I could even consider letting Dante back into our lives. "Show me proof," I said, pulling back from his touch even though it cost me something to break that contact, to put physical distance between us when every cell in my body seemed to be screaming for me to move closer instead. "Show me documentation of these legitimate businesses. Show me evidence that you've actually made changes rather than just telling me what you think I want to hear. Because I'm not that naive girl anymore, Dante. I'm a mother now. And I will not expose my son to your world unless I'm absolutely certain that it's safe for him. That you've truly become someone different than the man I left 6 years ago." Something that looked like respect flickered across Dante's features, and he nodded slowly, moving to his desk and pulling out a thick folder that he handed to me with steady hands. "Everything is in here," he said quietly. "Financial records showing the sale of our gambling operations, the closure of our loan sharking divisions, the transfer of protection rackets to legitimate security firms, everything I've done over the past 3 years to clean up the Salvatore empire and make it something I wouldn't be ashamed to pass down to my son, to our son, when the time comes." I took the folder with shaking hands, flipping through pages and pages of documents that would take me hours to fully process. But that seemed, at first glance, to support everything he was saying. To prove that he'd been systematically dismantling the criminal enterprise that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations and replacing it with something that resembled respectability, or at least a version of it that wouldn't guarantee Matteo a childhood shadowed by violence and fear. "This is going to take time," I said finally, closing the folder and meeting his eyes again. "Time for me to review all of this. Time for me to decide whether I believe you've really changed. Time for us to figure out how we're going to tell Matteo the truth and what role you're going to play in his life. And I need you to understand something, Dante. I will not be rushed. I will not be threatened. I will not be manipulated into making decisions before I'm ready. And if you try any of those tactics, if you try to use your power or your lawyers or your connections to force my hand, I will disappear again, and this time you'll never find us. I don't care how many resources you have or how long you're willing to search." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed my ultimatum. And I could see the struggle playing out across his face. The war between his instinct to control and dominate and his apparent desire to do things differently this time. To actually listen and compromise and respect my boundaries in a way he'd never managed during our marriage. "1 week," he said finally. "I'll give you 1 week to review everything, to think about what you want to do. But Sienna, I need you to understand something too. I've already lost 6 years with my son, and I'm not willing to lose any more time than absolutely necessary. So whatever you decide about us, about our relationship, I need to at least start building a connection with Matteo. I need him to know who I am and why I want to be part of his life. And I'm asking you, as his mother, as someone who clearly loves him enough to have sacrificed everything to keep him safe, to please give me that chance." The raw vulnerability in his voice, the way he was actually asking rather than demanding, the fact that he seemed to understand that he needed to earn his place in Matteo's life, rather than simply claiming it by right of biology, all of it made something in my chest crack open, made me realize that maybe, just maybe, Dante Salvatore had actually learned something in our 6 years apart, had actually grown into someone capable of putting someone else's needs before his own obsessive desire for control. I need to think about how to tell him, I said softly, exhaustion suddenly crashing over me like a wave, making my knees weak and my head spin with the weight of everything that had happened tonight. Everything that would need to happen in the days and weeks ahead. I need to figure out the right way to explain that the man from the restaurant is his father, that I've been lying to him his entire life about why he doesn't have a dad like other kids. And I need to do it in a way that doesn't make him feel betrayed or confused or scared. "Let me help you," Dante said. And there was something so earnest in his expression, so genuinely concerned, that I found myself nodding before I'd fully thought through the implications. "Let me come to your apartment tomorrow. Let me be there when you tell him. Let me answer his questions and try to build a bridge between us. And after that, we can figure out the rest. Custody arrangements, visitation schedules, how we're going to co-parent a child who deserves better than two parents who can't stand to be in the same room together." The fact that he'd said co-parent rather than demanding full custody or insisting on taking Matteo away from me entirely made me realize that maybe his promises of change weren't completely empty. That maybe he was actually capable of putting our son's well-being before his own ego and need for control. And that tiny spark of hope was more terrifying than any threat he could have made, because hope meant vulnerability. Hope meant opening myself up to the possibility of being hurt again. Hope meant admitting that some part of me still wanted to believe that Dante Salvatore could be more than just a beautiful monster in an expensive suit. "Tomorrow at 10, I heard myself say, committing to something that felt simultaneously right and completely insane. "You can come to our apartment tomorrow morning at 10, and we'll tell Matteo together, and then we'll see what happens, but Dante, I need you to promise me that no matter what he says, no matter how he reacts, you won't push too hard, you won't try to force a relationship before he's ready, because he's just a little boy. And this is going to be confusing and overwhelming, and he needs time to process everything just like I do." "I promise," Dante said. And then he did something completely unexpected. He pulled me into his arms, holding me against his chest in an embrace that was somehow both protective and seeking protection. And I could feel the rapid beating of his heart. Could feel the slight tremor in his hands that suggested he was nowhere near as controlled as he appeared. And for just a moment, I let myself relax into his hold. Let myself remember what it felt like to share burdens rather than carrying them alone. Let myself imagine a future where maybe, somehow, we could find a way to be a family, despite everything that had broken between us. Living 20 yards from Dante Salvatore was like sleeping next to a loaded gun. Thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. A constant state of heightened awareness that left me exhausted and strangely alive in ways I hadn't felt since I'd walked away from our marriage 6 years ago. And it had only been 2 weeks since I'd reluctantly agreed to move into the guest house on his estate, after the conversation about telling Matteo the truth had evolved into something far more complicated and consuming than I'd ever anticipated. The guest house was beautiful, of course, because Dante didn't do anything halfway. With its 3 bedrooms and gourmet kitchen and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens. But it also felt like a cage, gilded and comfortable, but still a cage nonetheless, because I was acutely aware that every moment of our lives was now under Dante's watchful gaze, that he could see us coming and going, could monitor our routines, and insert himself into our daily existence in ways that made the boundaries I'd tried so hard to establish feel increasingly permeable and fragile. Matteo had taken the revelation about his father with the kind of resilient adaptability that children possessed, initially confused and asking questions that broke my heart. "Why didn't you tell me before, Mama? Didn't you think I wanted a daddy?" But then gradually warming to Dante's presence as my ex-husband proved surprisingly patient and gentle with our son in ways that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. I would watch from the guest house windows as Dante taught Matteo to play chess on the terrace, explaining strategy and patience with a tenderness I'd never witnessed during our marriage. Or I'd find them in the estate's library where Dante would read to our son in Italian, his deep voice wrapping around the lyrical words while Matteo listened with rapt attention, absorbing not just the language but this new reality of having a father who actually wanted to spend time with him, who showed up consistently and kept his promises, and demonstrated a capacity for gentleness that seemed fundamentally at odds with the man who'd once told me that emotions were weaknesses to be exploited. But it was the violence that still lurked beneath the surface that reminded me why I'd left in the first place, why I couldn't let myself be lulled into complacency by Dante's apparent transformation. And it happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I was supposed to be working from the guest house but instead found myself drawn to the main house by raised voices and the sound of something shattering. I'd entered through the kitchen, old habits dying hard, knowing the servant's entrance would let me approach unnoticed. And what I'd witnessed made my blood run cold, and my resolve harden even as some twisted part of me recognized the brutal efficiency with which Dante handled threats to his empire and, by extension, to us. 3 men were kneeling on the marble floor of his office, one of them bleeding from a clearly broken nose, and Dante stood over them with his knuckles split and bloody, his voice deadly calm, as he explained in graphic detail what would happen to anyone who thought they could steal from him or undermine his authority, or most importantly, come anywhere near his son. I must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp of shock or fear, because Dante's head snapped toward the doorway where I stood frozen, and I watched his expression shift from cold fury to something that looked almost like shame, as if he'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong, but couldn't quite bring himself to stop. "Get them out of here," he barked to his men, who immediately hauled the 3 bloodied captives to their feet and dragged them from the office. And then we were alone, standing on opposite sides of the room that suddenly felt too small to contain the enormity of what I'd just witnessed. The reminder that despite all his promises of change and legitimacy and building something better, Dante Salvatore was still fundamentally a man who solved problems with violence and intimidation. "This is why I can't do this," I said, my voice shaking with anger and disappointment and fear for what it meant that Matteo was now connected to this world, this darkness that I'd tried so hard to escape. "This is exactly why I left you, why I kept our son away from you, because you say you've changed, but then I find you beating men bloody in your office like some kind of medieval lord dispensing justice. And how am I supposed to believe that you're building a legitimate business when you're still operating like a mob boss who thinks violence is an acceptable solution to business disputes?" Dante was across the room in 3 long strides, gripping my shoulders with hands that were gentle despite the blood still drying on his knuckles, and his eyes were wild with something that looked like desperation, mixed with defiance. "Those men tried to kidnap Matteo from his school," he said, his voice rough with barely contained rage. "They were paid by the Castellanos to take our son, to use him as leverage against me in their war for territory. And you want me to what, Sienna? Call the police? File a report? Hope that the justice system protects my child when I know damn well that the only thing that will keep him safe is making sure that everyone in this city understands that touching my son means a fate worse than death?" The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my knees weak with terror, because this was my worst nightmare made manifest. The exact scenario I'd feared from the moment Dante had discovered Matteo's existence, and suddenly his violence didn't seem excessive or unjustified, but rather a necessary response to a very real threat against our child. "When did this happen?" I managed to ask, my mind racing with horrible images of Matteo being grabbed by strangers, of my son being terrorized and traumatized, and stolen from everything safe and familiar. "This morning, during pickup," Dante said, and now his hands were trembling slightly where they gripped my shoulders. "My men intercepted them before they could get to him. Matteo doesn't even know anything happened, but Sienna, this is my world. This is what I've been trying to tell you. There are people who will always see my family as targets, as weaknesses to exploit, and the only way to protect him is to make the cost of threatening him so high that no one will ever try again." I pulled away from his grip, wrapping my arms around myself, as if I could physically hold together the pieces of my carefully constructed denial about what it meant to be connected to Dante Salvatore. And I felt tears streaming down my face even as I tried to maintain some semblance of composure. "We need more security," I heard myself say, my voice hollow and distant. We need to move Matteo to a different school, somewhere with better protocols, and I need to know every single threat assessment, every piece of intelligence your people gather about potential dangers, because I will not be kept in the dark about risks to my son's safety, just because you think protecting me from the truth is somehow noble or kind." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a kind of respect mixed with relief that I wasn't running, that I was instead demanding to be included in the security decisions that would shape our son's life. "There's a private academy on the estate grounds," he said quietly. "Top-tier education, vetted staff, controlled environment where every entrance and exit is monitored by my best men. And I've already enrolled him pending your approval because I knew after today that sending him to a public school was too dangerous, too many variables we can't control." The fact that he'd made this decision without consulting me should have made me furious, should have triggered all my defenses about autonomy and control, and not being steamrolled by his tendency to simply take charge of situations, but instead I found myself nodding because the truth was that I didn't know how to navigate this world of threats and security protocols and calculating the cost-benefit analysis of different defensive strategies. And Dante did. And maybe that was what co-parenting with a former mob boss actually looked like. Surrendering control over the things he understood better while maintaining my authority over the emotional and developmental aspects of raising our son. "Show me the school," I said, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. "Show me the security setup. Introduce me to the teachers, and then we're going to sit down and have a very long conversation about what happens next. About how we keep Matteo safe without completely imprisoning him in fear. Because I won't let him grow up the way you did, Dante. Constantly looking over his shoulder and learning that the world is nothing but threats and violence and the need to strike first before someone strikes you." Dante's expression softened into something that looked almost like gratitude, and he reached out tentatively, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear in a gesture so tender that it made my heart ache. "I don't want that for him either," he said softly. "I want him to have the childhood I never did, the security and innocence and ability to just be a kid, without carrying the weight of this world on his shoulders. And maybe that's impossible given who I am and what I've done. But I'm going to try, Sienna. I swear to you, I'm going to try to give him something better than what I had." We stood there in his blood-spattered office, and despite everything, despite the violence I'd just witnessed, and the threats that now shadowed our lives, and the complicated history between us, I felt something shift, some fundamental realignment of how I saw Dante, and what we might be capable of building together, if we could just find a way to navigate the impossible space between his darkness and my light, between his instinct for control and my need for autonomy, between the love I'd once felt for him and the fear that still gripped my heart whenever I let myself imagine trusting him again. They came for my son at dawn, and I realized that loving Dante Salvatore meant living in perpetual war, meant accepting that our lives would always be balanced on the knife's edge between the safety we tried to build and the violence that sought to tear it down. And as I heard the first gunshots echoing across the estate grounds while the sky was still painted in shades of pink and gold, my first thought wasn't fear for myself, but absolute terror for Matteo, who was sleeping peacefully in his bedroom at the guest house, completely unaware that the Castellanos had launched a full assault on everything we'd tried to protect. I was out of bed and running before my mind had fully processed what was happening, my bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floors as I raced toward Matteo's room, and I burst through his door to find him sitting up in bed. His dark eyes, Dante's eyes, wide with confusion and the first stirrings of fear as the sounds of warfare grew louder and closer, punctuated by shouts in Italian and the unmistakable crack of automatic weapons being fired with deadly intent. "Mama, what's happening?" Matteo asked, his voice small and trembling, and I gathered him into my arms with a fierceness born of pure maternal instinct, wrapping my body around his as if I could shield him from bullets and violence and the reality that his father's world had finally come crashing through the walls we'd tried so desperately to build around him. "Stay with me, baby. Don't let go of me no matter what happens," I whispered against his hair, and then I was carrying him toward the reinforced panic room that Dante had insisted on installing in the guest house, a decision I'd initially resisted as paranoid and excessive, but now thanked God for as I punched in the code with shaking fingers and heard the heavy steel door slide open with a hydraulic hiss that seemed impossibly loud against the chaos erupting outside. I had just gotten Matteo inside, had just begun to seal us into that concrete and steel sanctuary, when I saw through the window that Dante was fighting his way across the lawn toward us, his movements brutal and efficient as he cut down anyone who stood between him and his family. And I watched in horrified fascination as he took a bullet to the shoulder but barely slowed, his face a mask of cold fury and desperate determination that made him look more like an avenging angel than a man. The panic room sealed just as Dante reached the guest house, and I could hear him shouting orders to his men through the reinforced walls, organizing a defensive perimeter and coordinating a counterattack with the kind of tactical precision that spoke to years of experience in exactly this kind of warfare. And I held Matteo against my chest while he cried and asked questions I couldn't answer about why people were trying to hurt us, and whether his daddy would be okay, and if this was all his fault somehow, because he'd been bad or done something wrong that made the bad men angry. "This is not your fault, sweetheart. None of this is your fault," I told him over and over again, rocking him like I used to when he was a baby, trying to be strong and calm, even though my own heart was racing and my mind was spinning with terrible possibilities about what would happen if Dante fell. If his men couldn't hold the line, if the Castellanos succeeded in breaching our defenses and taking the one thing in this world that mattered more to me than my own life. The battle seemed to last forever, but probably only took 20 minutes before the sounds of gunfire began to taper off, replaced by the wail of approaching sirens and the shouted commands of Dante's men as they secured the perimeter and rounded up the surviving attackers. And when the panic room door finally opened, it was Dante standing there, blood soaking through his shirt from the shoulder wound and splattered across his face from sources I didn't want to think about too carefully, but alive, breathing, victorious in the way that violent men measured victory, by the fact that his enemies were dead or captured and his family was safe. "Papa!" Matteo cried, and hearing my son use that word for the first time, hearing him claim Dante as his father with such innocent certainty, made something crack open in my chest, some final wall I'd been maintaining against the reality that we were a family now, broken and complicated, and bound together by blood and violence and something that might actually be love if I could ever let myself trust it fully. Dante fell to his knees despite his injury, gathering Matteo into his arms with a tenderness that seemed impossible given the carnage he'd just orchestrated, and I watched father and son hold each other, while Dante murmured reassurances in Italian, promising safety and protection and a future where this kind of mourning would never happen again. And I wanted desperately to believe him, even though I knew that men like Dante Salvatore could never truly escape their pasts, could never completely leave behind the violence that had shaped them into who they were. "You're hurt," I heard myself say, my voice surprisingly steady given that I was trembling all over, adrenaline and fear and relief making my legs weak and my vision swim with unshed tears. "I'm fine. It's nothing. Just a flesh wound," Dante said dismissively, but I could see the blood pooling. Beneath him, could see the way his face had gone pale despite his attempts to appear strong and unaffected. And suddenly I was moving, kneeling beside him and pressing my hands against his shoulder to staunch the bleeding, while Matteo watched with wide, frightened eyes. "You need a hospital," I told Dante firmly, using the voice I reserved for moments when I wouldn't accept any argument or deflection. And for once he didn't fight me, didn't insist on his own strength or invincibility, but simply nodded and let me help him to his feet, while his men rushed forward to support their boss and escort us to the armored SUV that would take us to the private medical facility, where Dante's people could treat his injuries without involving police reports or uncomfortable questions about how exactly he'd acquired a bullet wound. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of doctors and debriefings, and Matteo finally falling asleep in my arms from sheer emotional exhaustion. And it was only when we were alone in Dante's private recovery room, our son sleeping peacefully on a cot beside the hospital bed while monitors beeped softly in the background, that I finally let myself break down, let myself cry for the life we'd almost lost, and the future that still felt impossibly fragile despite Dante's promises and his blood spilled in defense of our family. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. Knew that I was already in too deep to walk away now. That Matteo loved his father and needed his father, and I loved them both more than I'd ever admitted even to myself. "You won't have to," Dante said, reaching for my hand with his uninjured arm, his fingers threading through mine with a sureness that felt like coming home after a long and terrible journey. "The Castellanos are finished. Their leadership is dead or in custody. And I've sent word through every channel that my family is off limits, that anyone who even thinks about threatening my son or my wife will face consequences that make this mourning look merciful. And I know you hate this part of me, this capacity for violence and ruthlessness, but Sienna, it's what keeps you safe. It's what protects Matteo, and I will never apologize for doing whatever it takes to ensure that you both wake up every morning in a world where you're protected and loved and valued above everything else I've ever built or conquered." I looked at this man, this beautiful monster who destroyed me and remade me and somehow become essential to my existence despite every rational reason to run. And I realized that maybe love wasn't supposed to be safe or easy or free from darkness. That maybe the kind of love worth having was the kind that required courage and compromise and the willingness to see someone fully, their violence and their tenderness, their cruelty and their capacity for change, their past sins and their desperate attempts at redemption, and choose them anyway, choose to build something together even when the foundation was cracked, and the walls were stained with blood, and the future was anything but certain. "I need you to promise me something," I said quietly, my thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand, while I tried to find the words for what I needed, what our family needed if we were going to survive intact. "I need you to promise that you'll keep transitioning away from this life, that you'll keep building legitimate businesses and distancing yourself from the violence, not because I'm asking you to change who you are fundamentally, but because Matteo deserves a father who comes home every night, who lives to see him grow up and graduate and maybe have children of his own someday. And I can't watch you die, Dante. I can't survive losing you now that I've finally let myself admit that I never stopped loving you despite everything." The confession hung in the air between us, words I hadn't meant to say but couldn't take back. And I watched Dante's eyes fill with something that looked like wonder and relief and a fierce possessive joy that would have terrified me 6 years ago, but now just made me feel anchored, grounded, connected to something larger and more powerful than my fear. "Ti amo, Sienna," he said, pulling me closer despite his injury, kissing me with a passion that tasted like blood and tears and new beginnings. "I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too damaged and too afraid to show it properly. And I promise you, I swear on our son's life, that I will spend every day I have left becoming the man you both deserve, building a legacy that Matteo can be proud of, rather than one he has to escape from. And if you'll have me, if you'll give me this second chance that I know I don't deserve but desperately want, I will love you and protect you and cherish you the way I should have from the beginning." 6 months later, I stood in the garden, where Dante and I had been married the first time, watching Matteo call his father Papa, without hesitation, as they worked together to prepare for a small family dinner. And I realized that we'd somehow survived the darkness, had somehow found our way to something that resembled peace, even though I knew it would always be fragile, always be threatened by the shadows of Dante's past and the enemies who would never fully forgive or forget what he'd done in building his empire. But watching my son laugh with his father, watching Dante smile with genuine happiness that reached his eyes and transformed his face into something almost innocent, I understood that this was what love actually looked like in the real world. Not perfect or pure or untouched by pain, but resilient and complicated and worth fighting for despite all the reasons it should have failed. Dante pulled me close as the sun set over the estate, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and whispered against my hair that he loved me. And I let myself believe him. Let myself hope that maybe we could build something lasting from the broken pieces of who we'd been. And I knew that loving a monster came with darkness. But for the first time in 6 years, I finally saw light breaking through, warm and persistent, and refusing to be extinguished, promising that even the most damaged souls could find redemption if they were willing to fight for it, bleed for it, change for it, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that survived being shattered and somehow found the courage to piece themselves back together, stronger and truer for having been broken first.